Each morning he woke up, he found himself staring at the reflection in the looking-glass, stunned at the man who stared back at him. He'd taken the pendant off only the once and had immediately regretted it. The world going black once more, and the old aches and pains that had disappeared soon returning. It had so unnerved him that for the briefest moment he couldn't find the pendant, and even when he had, a part of him had thought that maybe it wouldn't work this time. Seeing the world come back into focus had been a huge relief, and he'd sworn he'd not take it off again unless he had to. He still didn't truly understand the magics involved. Jay had told him to speak to Melisandre and to Sierra, and that they'd both look through the books if he received no answer from either of them. The Red Priestess had explained that her own ruby was a gift from her allure, and she'd noticed some of the same markings on the pendant when Jay had shown it to her. Sierra explaining that hers was from a shy by the shadow. Both hers and Melisandre's had required blood also, but neither of them had access to dragon blood, and it made Aemon's pendant stronger. Aemon thought about that a lot. There was magic in blood, and in his family's most of all, though his nephew also brought a great deal from his Stark side, too. Dragons, though, were creatures of pure magic. Other than maybe Jay's direwolf, the only true creatures as such that they were known to be alive. There were tales, of course, of many others: krakens, ice spiders, grumpkins, and snarks. Aemon had read of them all. And yet, other than dragons and direwolves, he couldn't for certain say whether they existed or not. The library in King's Landing was both impressive and very much not so. It contained volumes that he'd read many years earlier, and very few that he had not. So he'd sent word to Marwyn and Lowell Mar to gather up all the books they'd found and to bring them to him. Yet he felt the truth of things was in the books that Jay himself held, the one that Sir Arthur had brought to him so many years earlier, and the one he'd found in Dragonstone, Daenerys' journal. While he waited for access to both, he threw himself into his new duties as Prince of House Targaryen, training with a sword under Sir Bonifer. Something he'd not wished the need to do, and yet his nephew was once again right on that. If I'm right about what's coming for us and what we may need to do to beat it, Uncle, then everyone will need to play their part. I know you have no wish to bear a sword, but sometimes it's forced upon us no matter what, and I'd rather you able to than not. Jay had been right. He may see himself as a maester, and he knew his knowledge and experience would be helpful to both his niece and nephews, but their house had to be protected at all costs. Many years earlier he'd been too old, too weak to do anything. When they had almost fallen, he'd never be so again. So he practiced with a sword, and he practiced with a dragon. Only one of those things bringing him true pleasure. Sanderix was everything he'd imagined. The bond they shared, something he'd never felt before, and something he knew only 4 other people could understand. Whenever he got the chance, he'd take to the sky and find himself just looking down on the world below him, seeing the Red Keep, the Sept of Baelor, Dragonstone, and Driftmark, and feeling that his joy in doing so was shared by the dragon. He'd look to see Dany, Sierra, Tyrion, and Jay, his nephew's bond different, and not requiring him to at times be with Rhaenys, yet all of them felt exactly the same way. They'd been gifted something truly special, and unlike those who came before them, they'd not waste it. Today, though, was a special day, just as it had been a couple of days earlier when he'd seen his nephew married and watched him crown his queen. To see Jay so happy made his heart fuller than it had been in years, that the young boy who'd come to him all those years ago was now a king, a husband, and by the sounds of how people cheered, loved, meant the world to him. Now he'd get to see the great and the good come and kneel and swear fealty, and he'd stand and look into each of their eyes. Should any waver, show any doubt, or seem to be playing their house false, then he'd see them brought low. He heard the voice call out and shook his head, fixing up the last of his buttons as he walked from his room. Daenerys, he asked, surprised to see her. It's almost time. I had hoped you'd walk with me, she said, and he smiled as he did as she asked. He looked to the giant man outside his door, Sir Walder. a man who intrigued him greatly and who had almost caused his heart to still when he had first seen him. That the man was from the north had at first been the only thing that had made him question his thoughts, until he remembered that Duncan had gone there too many years earlier, among the very many places that he and Egg had traveled. The more he then looked to the man, the more he saw it clearly. Sir Walder O'Lears was a ghost from his past, and one he could barely look at. Not the only one, as he'd soon find out. They were walking to the throne room when he met another, the girl looking even more like Duncan than Walder did, though her hair was blonde and her eyes blue. Beneath that superficial difference, she was Duncan. Come again, and Aemon knew he needed to find out more about Brienne of Tarth. Now, though, was not the time, and he walked into the throne room and took his place, as did the 4 members of the Kingsguard that were now here. Around the room, the royal guard stood while the room itself was as full as it had been for the feast, he felt. Aemon's eyes soon roaming over all who were present, watching each of them carefully. His Grace, King Jaehaerys Targaryen, and Her Grace, Queen Margaery Targaryen. The herald said, and he watched as Jay and Margaery walked in. His nephew was wearing a matching outfit to his and Tyrion's, the black and red only broken by the Targaryen pin he wore on his chest. Aemon looked to see Egg's ring on his finger and the crown of the Conqueror on his head, and smiled to see them both on a Targaryen king as they should be. Margaery too wore House Targaryen colors, as did Dany and Shiera. The image they were presenting was of a house united, and united they were. A large chair had been placed beside the Iron Throne, and only the king and queen would sit. Aemon waiting until they did before looking out at the assembled lords and ladies once more. He saw them then, the giant guards of Olenna Tyrell, and had he seen them alone then, perhaps he'd not have noticed it. But Sir Walder, Lady Brienne, his thoughts were already there, and now he could see nothing else. He found himself chuckling when he thought of it. Duncan had been far busier than he had ever known. Aemon's eyes quickly looking for large men around the room and seeing the Umbers and the Hound, though not seeing the same looks exactly. He was not discarding them either. He'd need to give Maester Melan's tome a read, he felt, just to see how many descendants of his brother's truest friend there may be in the realm. My lords and ladies, you're gathered here today to swear your fealty to the king and queen. Move forward when called, Jaime Lannister said, and Aemon smiled as he looked to witness history being made. King's Landing, 298 AC, Robb Stark. All through Jon's, Jay's wedding, he had found himself torn between looking to his brother and to his own betrothed, Winifred looking incredible to his eyes. When they danced later that night, he had asked her if their own wedding would need to be so elaborate. Both of them had agreed to have a dual wedding with both faiths to be represented. While he kept to the old gods and their children would be raised in his faith, he knew Jon had done the same for Margaery, and Winifred had been most delighted at the suggestion. His father and Winifred's grandfather, too, seemed happy with it. Wyman especially, as he resolved himself to seeing his daughter marry under the old gods. For Robb himself, he didn't really feel it should have been an issue. He followed the old gods, his children would, and so what if his wife did not? True, he knew that there may be some who weren't best pleased with another Lady of Winterfell being a follower of the Seven. But those people weren't best pleased that it wasn't their daughter he was to marry in the first place. Winifred had enjoyed the wedding, Robb hearing her, Willa and Elves speaking on Margaery's dress and on the crowning outside the sept, though both his betrothed and future good sister enjoyed the wedding night feast even more. His father had told him that the Tyrells had spared no expense to see their daughter wed, and Robb had never attended a feast the like of it before. Yet he was glad it was over, and he found himself looking forward to the tourney, one that he'd actually be competing in this time. Just a jousting, though. And though he dared not think he'd win, the idea of crowing his love was something he couldn't quite shake from his mind. They were having dinner when his father told him about Jay's plans for the North, Robb finding the idea of the gift coming back into Northern hands one that most would welcome. While his father didn't see the benefits of Jay's plans for Brandon's gift, he did. The added layer of protection, and the fact they'd now have a royal house in their lands, even one sworn directly to the king, one which brought hidden benefits. Our bannermen won't be happy, son. They rarely are with any change, father, he said, receiving a smile from his father. But they need to be made aware of the good points. They'll know the bad themselves, so we need to make them aware of the benefits, he said, and his father looked at him doubtfully. What benefits? We'd firstly have another great house, father. Aye, true enough, they'd not directly be sworn to us. But when it comes to protection for the North, do you care as long as they fight on our side? Would they? His father asked, not sounding so sure. Unless we were going against the king. Aye. Do we have any plans to go against the king? He asked, and his father shook his head. Not J. Harry's, but how do we know there won't be another Ares in the future? How do we know there won't be another Red King, father? We don't. No one does. So we treat the Boltons with respect, but never let them too close. We don't end their line or seek them gone, do we? And should the North call, have they not answered it? Always? He said, and his father nodded. That's not the only benefit. What other? Should the North be faced with a threat beyond our capabilities, the Crown now has another reason to come to our aid. Aye, Jay would come if we needed him. But as you say, what about another king? Here we're tied to the Crown by blood and they to the North by blood also. It wouldn't just be us they'd come to aid. It'd be their own house, too, his father said contemplatively. Guy, Rob said, and his father's smile was truer now. That he'd been able to reassure his father was something he'd been most pleased about. He'd then, at his father's request, spoken to Lord Wyman, who spoke almost as he did on the benefits of having a royal house in the North. Rob tried not to smirk at the fact his mind and his future good-grandfather's seemed more in tune politically than his and his father's did. Dressing the next day, he joined with his father and the lords of the North as they went to swear fealty to the crown. The wardens and lords, paramount to be first, followed by the other lords and their heirs. When Jon arrived, Rob noticed immediately the image he wished to present. House Targaryen was back in power and was united. He looked to see Tyrion and Aemon, Jon's uncles, and Daenerys and Shiera, his aunts, finding himself almost mesmerized when he looked to Shiera and Aemon in particular. The idea that these were both people over 100 name days old was something he couldn't get his head around. Neither of them looked as old as his father, and yet Shiera had been Bloodraven's lover, Aemon brother to Aegon the Unlikely. Were it not for the dragons, or his connection to Grey Wind, then Rob felt he'd have dismissed the idea of magic such as this completely. As it was, he knew it to be true, though what magic made it so he didn't understand. When he heard Jaime Lannister call, he moved beside his father. Though it should only be the warden themselves, Jay had wished for the heirs to present themselves also. Lord Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, and Warden of the North, and his son and heir, Robb Stark. A voice called out, and he stepped forward with his father and drew his sword, both of them kneeling and looking to the Iron Throne. I, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, pledge my sword, my blood, and my house to House Targaryen and their graces, King Jaehaerys and Queen Marjorie. I do so freely and without reservation. From now until the end of my days, I'll serve your graces, and my house will serve in my stead in perpetuity. His father said, his voice firm. I, Robb Stark, the heir to Winterfell in the North, pledge my sword and my blood to House Targaryen. I shall honor my father's own oaths and pledge my house to yours in perpetuity. He said, and felt the eyes of the room on him. Time seemed to stand still, and though it was barely moments they knelt, it felt far longer than it should have been until Jon's voice rang out. Arise, Lord Stark, and be recognized as the Warden of the North. Arise, Lord Robb, and be recognized as heir. On behalf of her grace and myself, We accept your oaths and pledge to ask no act of you which would cause dishonor or harm to you or to your house." They rose and his father stepped forward, Jaime Lannister handing him the chain of wardenship, something he'd never seen his father, or any other warden for that matter, wear. Lord Jaime stepped forward alone. His daughter was his heir, and while Jon he knew had no issue naming her so, the girl was far too young to be made kneel in front of such a large crowd. Lord Jon and his heir Andar were next, and then Lord Mace and Willis, Robb seeing his sister look at the new master of coin and smile at him, which he took note of. "I, Mace Tyrell, Lord of Highgarden and Warden of the South, pledge my sword, my blood, my life, to House Targaryen and to their graces, King Jaehaerys and Queen Marjorie. I do so freely, happily, and with no reservations. From now until the end of my days, my king, my queen, I shall serve you both, and my house will serve you in perpetuity. I, Willis Tyrell, heir to Highgarden and master of coin, offer my sword, my blood, to House Targaryen. I shall honor my father's own oaths, and I too pledge myself and my house to yours in perpetuity. Arise, Lord Tyrell, and be recognized as our Warden of the South. Arise, Lord Willis, and be recognized as heir. On behalf of His Grace and myself, we accept your oath. We pledge to ask no act of you that would bring dishonor to you or your house," Marjorie said, her voice clear but her tone more friendly as she was speaking to her father and brother. Princess Arianne stepped forward, and Robb noticed how Prince Tyrion looked at her, smiling to himself at the thoughts that he wasn't only he whose eyes were drawn to the woman he was to marry. As the prince's eyes were on his betrothed as she swore her oaths, Robb's eyes were locked on his own. Winifred's smile in return was a welcome one. Lord Tytos Blackwood was next, and then Lady Shireen Baratheon and an older man who Robb had found out was Sir Davos Seaworth, the so-called Onion Knight. He'd laughed when he heard that, only for Sir Wylis to, while not reprimand him for doing so, set him straight on Sir Davos's deeds. Robb, quickly understanding why his future goodfather thought so highly of the man, being a man of the sea, his future goodfather felt a kinship with the former smuggler. Given what he found out Sir Davos had done, Robb felt the man more than most deserved his knighthood, and as he watched him kneel, he did so with much different eyes than he may once have. Feelings seemed a bit tense, as Lady Shireen pledged her house to Jon's in perpetuity. Given what House Baratheon had done, or almost done, to House Targaryen, it was something Robb could understand. Jon, though, seemed to feel no such tenseness, smiling at the girl when he bid her rise and named her Lady Paramount of the Stormlands. Robb's own tenseness, along with his father's and the Lords of the North's, all rose far higher when Asha Greyjoy stepped forward. "I, Asha Greyjoy, pledge my sword, my blood, and my ships to their graces King Jaehaerys and Queen Marjorie. I swear to keep my oaths to them and to House Targaryen from this day until my last, and I swear House Greyjoy to House Targaryen in perpetuity," Asha said to snorts which were soon stopped when Jon glared at Lord Glover and Lady Mage. "Arise, Lady Greyjoy, and be recognized as Lady Reaper and Lady of the Iron Islands. On behalf of Her Grace and myself, we accept your oaths and pledge to ask no act of you which would cause dishonor or harm to you or your house," Jon said as Asha rose. The snorts were now louder, and Robb watched as Jon stood and moved away from the Iron Throne, his brother not looking very happy at all. I'll not have anyone disparage someone for swearing their oaths. No matter their personal feelings, Lady Greyjoy is the Crown's choice for Lady of the Iron Islands. She's received the Crown's judgment and been forgiven for past transgressions, as have others in this room. Jon said, his voice loud as he glared at those who'd snorted. Robb looked to see Lady Shireen and the Storm Lords nod, along with Lord Royce and one or two of the Vale Lords. The oaths sworn before now do not matter. The oaths sworn here today do. Should anyone, and I mean anyone, break these oaths, then they'll find me not so forgiving. Should they live up to them, then they'll find the crown to be grateful and an ally. But here today, the oaths and those who swore them in good faith will be treated with the respect that any of you wish the crown to treat themselves with. He knew not, but as he looked around the room, he could see even those northern lords who'd been most displeased by a Greyjoy being named to run the Iron Islands after what they'd done, dared not speak up anymore. Their new king had steel in his veins and dragons at his beck and call, and only a fool would dare to test him on either. As Robb watched Asha Greyjoy walk from the throne room, as the king bid them enjoy the rest of their day, he knew what he had to do. He'd put it off for as long as he could, but he had no choice now. His former friend would be losing his head soon enough, and so he left to speak to Theon one last time. King's Landing, 298 AC, Jenna. Being called to account by a boy that you used to ensure wore his best clothes and kept his hair straight was a jarring experience. That Jay was able to do so calmly and without losing his temper only made her glad she was not Olenna. She, Allery, Ashara, and Daisy had been called in to meet with the king, Jenna knowing immediately what it was about, and wondering just how angry and annoyed he was going to be with them. Arriving at the room, she saw Loras and Sir Richard Horp were on guard. Loras, despite his white cloak and shiny armor, still looking to her like the boy who'd arrived in Casterly Rock all those years earlier. Someone who at times she'd find herself missing along with Jay. That they had grown up and achieved so much made her proud of the part she played, yet she missed the boys they had been too. The closeness they had all shared once, now changing and still not having found its center yet. Lady Jenna, the other ladies are waiting inside. Loras said and smiled at her as he knocked and then opened the door. Jenna, stepping in to see Ashara, Daisy, and Allery all sitting with varying degrees of comfort. Jay himself wasn't present, and given how he'd reacted earlier in the throne room to those who'd made their feelings for the Greyjoy clear, perhaps that was a good thing. Jenna smiled and took her seat, and declined when she was offered wine, only to have to rise almost at once when Jay and Tommen walked into the room. Her grandnephew looked good, and she could see the differences training made to him. The small, chubby boy almost completely gone now, and though he was still a boy, it was a harder one he was being fashioned into. "Ladies, forgive me. I was called away for a moment," Jay said, bidding them sit while he took his own. "That's quite a right, Your Grace," Ashara said with a soft smile. "I believe you know why I called you here," Jay said, and she looked to the others. "Your Grace, if I may," she said, and he nodded. "I was the main proponent of keeping the news from you, I felt." "I know what you felt, my lady," Jay said firmly. "I understand your reasons for it, all of your reasons for it." She watched as he took a breath, not to calm himself as he seemed incredibly so. More. She felt to decide what to say next. "I welcome the sentiment if not the act itself," Jay said softly. "Your Grace." Allery began only for him to shake his head. "No, my lady. What you all did almost cost me everything. Were you any other people then, you'd face harsher judgment for it. Was I not able to? Then I'd have never forgiven any of you for it." Jay looked at them, and she could see how Allery and Ashara dropped their eyes to the ground. She and Daisy tried to keep their eyes on his, but the look he gave them was one which forced even they to turn away. It wasn't anger or even one which he was using to make them feel guilt. If anything, he seemed to be hurting still, something that his next words made very clear. "Lady Olenna bore the brunt of my anger, my ladies. But I've had time to reflect, and I'll not rant or rave, scream or shout at you all. I know you did what you think was best for me, that you had my interests in heart. But by keeping this from me, you've broken the trust I have in you all. That you did it for the best of reasons matters, and yet it does not. But it will not happen again. Am I clear?" "Aye, Your Grace," she said. "Very good," he said, standing up and turning to walk to the door. stopping at it briefly and then walking through it anyway. She felt shamed a little, realizing now that to Jay it felt like a betrayal of sorts. And though it had not been meant that way, it clearly still was a bit. The others felt it too, Allery taking it particularly badly, and on that, she could understand why. They had almost cost her everything, her home, her family, everything. And though she still felt it right they'd thought how they had, she wondered if she had made the right choice to keep it from him. Walking from the room, she saw that Loras and Sir Richard were gone, and so she headed to the sparring yard. Finding both Kingsguard, the King, Tommen and Walder, Tion, Martin and Willem, all there readying for a lesson of some sort. Martin was facing off against Jay as they readied to spar, a small smile on her nephew's face. Were she not clear how upset Jay was, then this would have been enough to show her, sparring always being the way to clear his head. He was very much like Jamie in that regard. Her nephew, too, had always sought his comfort in the wielding of a sword. Jay spent almost an hour with the boys, and she stood watching every moment. He sparred with each of them, worked on their stances, gave them pointers, and set them against each other. Her sons had come on well, as had Willem, but Martin was special and Jay gave him fewer pointers than the others. Instead, he spoke softly to the boy. Jenna, watching as he nodded at whatever Jay was saying and smiling when she saw Jay then do the same to Tommen. "To be trained by a king," Jamie said, and she turned to see her nephew walking towards her. "Not many can say it," she said, trying to smile. Jamie seeing her face and looking out to the yard. "I'm sure he didn't mean to be so harsh," her nephew said softly, and Jenna looked at him wondering if Jay had told him that he was speaking to them today. He wasn't. Well, not angry, at least. It's strange that I feel worse, he didn't shout. He's had more time to think on it, yet it's rawer too, the wedding. Being with his new wife. Being here, in this place, Jamie said, looking around. The betrayals feel more real. I didn't. I know you didn't, as does he, gods. Jenna, do you really think he'd think that of you? He asked, and she shook her head. As Jay laughed when all 5 of the boys ganged up on him, swords scattered on the ground as they tried to grab the king. Of course he'd feel it a bit more, and it made more sense to her now about some of the things he was doing. The changes he was making to the realm were all because of one goal. Does he fear it may happen again? She asked, her brow furrowed. It'll never happen again, Jamie said determinedly, and she nodded her agreement on that she'd play her part to make sure it did not. As Jay sent each of the boys to their lessons, she watched him place each of the swords back on the rack and then scold Tommen before mussing his hair. When he looked up at her, she was happy to see his smile, glad he'd worked through things in his head and that what had been said seemed forgotten. Jenna knew she'd been right to keep it from him. The boy worried far too much, and the betrayal that Doran had committed would have led him down a dark path. He needed to be clear of mind to bring the realm under his control. His plans formed and readied before he dealt with a devious snake. No, she had been right to hide it from the boy. It was the king she should have told. King's Landing, 298 AC, Sierra. She looked out at the field and stood when Jay and Marjorie entered. The tourney. Something she had no true interest in, and something which brought up bad memories for her. It had been at a tourney that her father had set the seeds for everything, handing Damon a blade that while he had the skill to wield, he didn't deserve. That he'd done it more to spite Daron than for any other reason wasn't something she could be certain of, though she believed Brendan when he said it was so. As the competitors were welcomed to the tourney and the cheers rang around, Sierra looked on as the archery targets were set up and found herself reliving memories that were best forgotten. An image of Brendan and his weirwood longbow coming to her unbidden. While she'd not seen her father knight Damon or gift him Blackfire, she'd still been a babe in her mother's teat. She'd seen Brendan show his prowess in archery many times. Looking out as men lined up to take shots at targets, She found she no longer wished to be here, and so she began to cough and splutter to make a pretense to leave. That Jay wished to show their family off to their fullest was something she understood, but she had never wished for that to be the life she would lead. When Brendan was named Han, he thought that would be enough to gain her own, that it was his position she wished for, when in truth, it was only ever him. He scared her, thrilled her, inflamed her passions like no other, and shared her interests. Yet he, with them, like with everything else, reached too far, and it turned him into something that in the end she was repulsed by. "All you had to do was ask me to run with you," the voice called out in her head. But she had more than once and he had chosen the throne or being close to it over her, and where he looked when it came to magic was a place she'd never dare follow. Making her way back to the Red Keep with the royal guards by her side, she thought on her nephew and again worried he was walking the same path. Jaehaerys had more magic than anyone she'd ever believed could. He possessed more power than the warlocks, shadowbinders, red priests, and Brendan ever had. That he seemed inclined to look more into such thing both pleased and worried her. There was always a cost to be paid after all, and most times that cost was much too high. She and Brendan had paid that cost, and she'd not see her nephew do the same, and yet she knew that he must. The prince that was promised would bring the dawn, the prophecy said. But what dawn it was had never been made clear. Shiera believed it was the dawn of a new age. The balance in the world would be set right and magic once again would be something welcomed and not feared, something that made lives better and not worse. Brendan believed it too in his own way, but he believed only a man with resolve could dare to harness such power, that in the hands of a weaker man it would corrupt and destroy. It was something she agreed with, though not with Brendan thinking that man was he. Being ruthless and willing to do what others would not did not make you strong. Not having compassion, love, or a desire to leave the world a better place than you found it did not make you strong. As she sat in her room later that day and looked over the gems she found, as she began to think about the enchantments that could soon be possible, Shiera hoped beyond hope that her nephew was indeed as strong as he believed himself to be. "And?" She heard the soft voice and looked to see Danny standing over her as she leaned on the table. "Danny, did you fall asleep at the table?" Danny asked, a smirk on her face. "Obviously," she said, looking at the book in front of her and closing it. "How did the tourney go?" "Archery is fucking dull," Danny said, taking a seat on the edge of the table. "Daenerys Targaryen, what have I told you?" she said and saw Danny look abashed. "Sorry, but it is," her niece said, shrugging her shoulders. "Who won?" "Some prince from the Summer Isles. Jalabhar show. Tomorrow will be better. It's the melee," Danny said excitedly. She nodded, though she cared not for it either, and together with Danny they made their way to the dinner that her nephew was having for family. His Targaryen family, as Danny liked to call them. Jay had more than one, which was something she found incredibly amusing. The Starks, Tyrells, Martells, and the Lannisters, her nephew considered all of them family, and yet it was to their house he held his greatest concerns for. Their protection, their future, mattered far more to him than anything else in this world, just as it should be. After dinner she asked to speak to him. It was time they discussed the nature of what he was and what he would be, Jay seeming almost eager to explore it more also. She knew that he'd looked through the books. What he'd found he'd not told her or anyone else as far as she knew, and she found that intrigued her too. Was there good news in Daenerys' journal, in the book Sorella had brought with her from Casterly Rock? Or was her nephew worried about something and keeping it to himself? Either way, she'd find out on the morrow. And as she slept that night, it was to dreams she'd rather forget, to memories of red eyes and long white hair that she had once found so attractive. Waking early, she washed and broke her fast and waited for Jay to arrive, glad to find it was not a long wait she had to endure. Her nephew carried the books with him and she welcomed him inside, the two of them taking up their seats opposite each other. He didn't look perturbed or worried. In fact, he seemed anything but, and she wondered how much he had managed to read. "You wish to speak, Aunt," Jay said, and she nodded. "What do you know about Brendan Jay truly?" She listened as he told her. First the history that everyone knew, and then things that even she did not. Her nephew's encounters with her former lover, something she'd not expected. "I met Maya and Gwenny's, his sisters. Both of them warned me about their brother. Sir Walder was trapped in a cage that I believe Bloodraven built to hold him, though I'm still unclear why. Aemon obviously told me some too, but I think I saw him, or part of him, when I broke Walder from his cage." "Saw him?" she asked curiously. "Nan, Maya, Walder's great-grandmother, told me the ravens are his. When I was helping with Walder, I saw one with 3 eyes. It flew far north, and when I followed it to where Walder was, I saw it again. Renix burned down the tree it was in. Whether it took flight or perished, I don't know, but I believe Bloodraven to be a warg. He was a strong one, though I'm not sure if even he is as strong as you. 1,000 eyes and one," Jay said, and she shivered. 1,000 eyes and one. "These, I've read them. Look, and you'll see," Jay said, handing her the books, and she looked to see nothing. No words, no writing, nothing. Blank pages where they had once been words before. "I don't understand," she said, confused. "Only the prince that was promised can bring the dawn. Buying. I thought both books to be linked, 2 halves which together led to answers. They are far more than that. But they're blank, Jay. There are no words? For you. For me. I see them clear. They were written for me, and they are locked to all but me. My blood alone can open them, and now is not the time." Jay said, looking at her, and she shook her head. "Why not now? What do you mean now is not the time?" She asked, her voice worried and concerned. "Wait. Until Bloodraven is passed, it's too dangerous for even me to know the full extent of what's in them. The 3-eyed raven must fall, Aunt. Dawn brings the light into the world, and Brynden Rivers is a creature of shadow and darkness." Shiera looked to Jay and could see he was speaking what he felt was the truth. Yet it sent a shudder down her spine to hear him speak in such a way, remembering how sure Brynden had been once also. "King's Landing, 298 AC, Olenna." Marjorie had put her and Mace in their place, and she had felt such pride at her for doing so, that her thorns were so sharp was something that Olenna knew would stand her in good stead. She had made it clear just how lucky they were, and nothing she had said was untrue. For them to complain of receiving disfavor would smack of hypocrisy. It hadn't actually been the plan itself that she'd taken issue with. Mace had, of course. But for Olenna, it was that she hadn't seen it coming. She had thought Jay intended to place their houses in the disloyal kingdoms, that he'd seek to keep the Vale, Stormlands, Riverlands, and maybe even Dorne in check. But that they, the West and the North, would be left as they were. They had, after all, risen and supported the king in being leal and true. Yet it seemed they too were not to be forgotten in the king's new plans, and it had taken her aback at first. In the end, she'd been glad it was Marjorie who'd come to tell them. Had it been Jay and they'd acted so disrespectfully. Then she shuddered to think how he'd have reacted. He may have forgiven her for keeping her suspicions about Doran to herself, but she still felt the scar from that wound remained. So she'd taken the first opportunity she could to speak to Marjorie and tell her how sorry she was, to explain her reasons for acting how she did. Her granddaughter understanding, but not fully accepting her apology, and Olenna had felt so proud of her golden rose once more. "I am the queen, grandmother. If I come with a decree, it's to be followed, family or not. What I say cannot be answered with disrespect. Questions in private are welcome. When I ask for your opinions and advice, I'll be more than pleased to listen. But if I say it's to be done, then it's to be done." Marjorie had laid down the law. changing their relationship forever in the process. Her sweet, beautiful little girl who had run to her for advice and deferred to her will was gone. In her place, a proud, confident young woman now stood, a queen who deferred to no one at all. 5 and 10 years of wishing, hoping, of lessons both overt and not, of talks that carried little pearls of wisdom, all now proven to be more than worthwhile. She'd seen the culmination of that as Marjorie had been wed, looked on, and felt her heart threaten to burst from her chest when she'd watched her crowned on the steps of the great sept by the king's own hand. As the crowd had cheered, she'd felt on the verge of tears, and a few had fallen after the feast that night. When Marjorie had told her that things had gone well in the marriage bed, Olenna had felt the last crumbs of doubt fall away. That she and her husband had found pleasure with each other was the removal of the last stumbling block to a full and true future. Had she her way, then she'd have wished them to have an heir sooner than they intended, but she'd not begrudged them their time together. Standing in the throne room when the oaths were sworn, she'd felt that pride rise once more, and so it was with that thought she'd gone back to her room later that day. Willis walked with her, and she could tell by the noise of his cane that he had something on his mind, Olenna simply waiting for him to bring it up once they reached her room. It didn't take long, as once they were sitting, he did just that. "I wish to speak on my future, grandmother." "Of course," she said softly, hearing the hesitancy in his voice. "A match," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Have you considered one for me?" "You know which match I seek for you, Willis. You've made it clear how you feel about it," she said, slighted irritably. "I may have been rash," he said. And she sat up a little straighter. "Willis, I had thought the age difference, my leg, that's no barrier to a match, and should anyone dare." She smiled. She'd interrupted him, and then he did the very same right back to her, Willis seeming more than determined to make this match. "I know that now, grandmother. I seek a match with Sansa Stark. I understand we would need to wait a number of years, but for her, I'm willing to wait," he said with a soft smile. "It is what you wish for, truly. Not because you know it's what I desire," she asked, and he nodded. "It is. Then I shall speak to Lord Stark. I will see this done, even if I need to speak to the king and queen themselves, Willis. I give you my oath on that." "Thank you, grandmother," her grandson said, standing up and turning to walk away. "I'm happy for you, Willis, truly," she said, and he smiled as he left the room. She quickly sent left to fetch Allery, eager to share the news with her good daughter. Olenna had wished the match to tie them closer to both the king and the north. Only the West was a possible better match than the North in relation to how Jay would feel. One Frow's, Sansa was his favorite sister, and so she knew even before she spoke to Ned Stark, she'd need to bring Jay on board first. As she waited for Allery, she wondered just how best it was to do that. Should she speak to Marjorie? Jay himself? She wasn't quite sure, and perhaps it needed to be them both at the same time. That way she'd not be accused of using either or subverting them to get her way. In the end, it didn't matter. She had known from early on what Sansa felt for Willis. It was far more than a young girl's crush, and the girl had come on in leaps and bounds since she'd been staying in Highgarden. She smiled, remembering that Marjorie had named her as one of her ladies-in-waiting, and more so thinking of a future with her as the Lady of Highgarden. A queen and Willis wed to a good woman. A smart, capable woman. Even with how far they'd climbed, they were still growing strong. The Vale 28 AC, Littlefinger. Her behavior was becoming more and more erratic, and on the journey to Gulltown, they'd had to drug her more than once. In truth, she'd barely been conscious for more than a few hours. Her screams, loud declarations that the dragon would find them and that they needed to be indoors, were not something conducive to a stealthy escape. Something that the crowning and wedding made evermore his only option. Petter had hoped to have more time, that the new king would move more slowly, and he could have had all his arrangements in place before leaving. A wedding tourney, oaths of fealty, and just spending time with his soon-to-be new wife should have taken moons. The Dragon King was moving far too quickly, though. The wedding and oaths all had been scheduled within a couple of weeks of taking the city, the tourney too, and once done he'd then look his way. The veil offered no protection. Harding couldn't stand up to him, and he'd received word that the man had learned of Cat and himself. There was no way he'd allow someone to use her as their bargaining chip. She was his to use, only his. And he would do so however he wished. But to do that they needed to be away from here, and so he'd hastily arranged the ship and would see to arrangements in Bravos once he got there. This was not the end of him. His plans could still play out. They just needed to be adapted to deal with something he had never planned for: dragons. "How is she?" he asked the servant as they sat by the campfire. "She woke, my lord. Said she'd seen him again. I gave her the drink as you ordered." "Good. Were he a man who believed in such things? Then Cat's dreams would scare him too. The idea of not being safe in the open and of having a dragon chasing after them was one that held some merit. Just not how she imagined it. He hated being in the open. Bandits, mountain clans, patrols sent by Harold Harding were all things that worried him. His own small force of men would scare most, but not all, often in an encounter with any who attacked them. Anything could happen. As for the dragon chasing them, he could only pray that he'd not started yet, beseech the gods, and hope he had enough time. After eating his meal and making his way to his tent, he looked forward to making it to Snakeswood and to be indoors for a night. They'd passed Coldwater Burn, and though the man was indebted to him, Lord Royce Coldwater was not a meek servant of his, nor a man who thought him a friend, unlike Lord John Linderley. In time, he'd have had far more of the Vale Lords in his pocket. In time, he'd have had the Vale itself. But he had run out of time and now was forced to deal with those he trusted completely, and they were few and far between. Lord John was one such man, and they could take the ship from Snakewood to Gulltown as he'd arranged. He lay down beside his still sleeping wife and drifted off himself, thoughts of revenge and of rising once more filling his head. "Me lord, it's morning," the servant said, and Petter rolled over, nodding to the girl and looking to see Cat wasn't beside him. "My wife?" he asked, slightly panicked. "Woke an hour ago, my lord. She's breaking her fast." He felt relieved at that and hurriedly dressed, leaving the tent to find Cat sitting and eating by the fire. She was looking once more just how he dreamed she would, though it did not last long. After bidding her good morning and breaking his own fast, they were readying the carriage when it began, his wife's screams loud and piercing. The dragon comes for us all. He watches, he always watches. Run, we must run. The eagle sees all." She hit him hard when he tried to calm her, the blow stunning him for a few moments, and it took 3 of his guards to restrain her. Peter nodded to the servant who quickly brought over the draft, and though Cat resisted, she eventually was forced to drink it, and not long after was finally calmed down. "Put her in the carriage, we ride now," he said, and the guards did as he asked, though he noticed the looks they gave him. He cared not for their judgment. His coin bought their loyalty, and he still had plenty of that to do what needed to be done. As he climbed into the carriage, he felt the hairs on his neck begin to rise, and he turned to see an eagle sitting on a branch in the nearest tree, its eyes on him all the way. Despite the momentary shudder that ran down his spine, he chuckled as he closed the carriage door. Falcons and eagles, the Vale had much of both. They arrived at Snakeswood that night, Lord John greeting them, and though the man looked at Cat curiously, he never questioned him on her, something he appreciated. While Cat was at rest in his rooms, as he called it, Peter listened as Lord John spoke of the realm, each word from the man's mouth only making his need to depart ever more pressing. Finding out that the boat was ready and ensuring Lord John that his debt was paid in full, Peter enjoyed his meal and then the comfort of his room. He was not made to sleep outdoors. It was in keeps, better ones than even this one, that he belonged. That the ship was tattered and looked in need of repair caused him some concern. But Lord John assured him that was helpful, given his purpose. "No one tries to attack an old wreck like this one, Bader. We've been able to use it to great effect without the worry of pirates and the like," Lord John said. "I thank you, John. When I return, I'll send for you." "Then I look forward to your return, Petter. I wish you good fortune." "Aye, you too, old friend," he said, gripping the man's hand tightly. The seas were rough, and it gave him more of an excuse to keep Cat drugged. The captain happy with his explanation that his wife had sickness of the sea. When he saw Witch's Isle after almost a week of travel, it brought him great relief. Knowing now that he'd be in Gulltown within the next 2 days and in Bravos in a little over a week. A different man may have worried for the woman who lay in his cabin, yet he did not. The illusion of who she had been soon shattered by the truth of who she was now. When he'd fallen out of love with her, he knew not, only that he most certainly had, and were she not a means to an end, then he may have instructed the servant to give her a heavier dose, or simply thrown her overboard. His nights were spent taking his pleasure with a woman who couldn't even pretend he was giving her any. Only one night did she stir, and the words she said had him spending far more quickly the image she put in his head, one that hastened that end. "Sansa, my sweet child, forgive me," Cat had moaned. Peter smiled now, not just at the memory of the last words Cat had spoken in his earshot. He now far preferred to be elsewhere when she awoke. The thoughts that had filled his head ever since were ones that refused to go away, younger and more beautiful, the voice would say, and he'd close his eyes and picture her just like that. His fantasies of a night many years earlier no longer showing him Cat's face, but one younger and more beautiful, and it only made his plans more desperate to succeed. "Gulltown, milord," the guard said as he entered his cabin. "Excellent. Make sure my wife is ready to disembark." King's Landing, 298 AC. J. Harry's Targaryen. Happiness was a strange thing, something that he'd never known he could feel so completely, and he had always expected to be a fleeting emotion. That just like when he'd get angry or sad, he'd feel it, and then it would diminish over time. It'd be less biting, not as sharp, and then he'd return to his normal state until something made it rise once more. To his surprise, he'd found though it was not like that, and while he'd lose his temper, feel anger and even sadness when he looked through his father's things, or when thoughts of his mother would enter his head, he now also felt true happiness each and every day. No matter the brief turns his mood would take, the same feeling would soon come back, and as he looked to his wife as she lay beside him in bed, it was clear what the reason for his happiness was. He gently moved her hair from her face and watched her sleep, that grin he loved so very much still present on her face. They'd found great pleasure with each other since they'd first lain together, both of them still exploring and learning what it was that the other liked, both of them eager to find out everything they could about each other's wants and desires. Yet that alone wasn't the reason he felt so very happy. It was something far simpler than even the fact they worked so well together that way. Having her with him, being able to spend as much time with her as he wished, listening to her advice, and even arguing with her about his plans, that more than anything he felt was the true reason for his joy. They were together. She and he were in this together, and for that he could only thank the gods, as he knew that he wouldn't be able to do this alone. "Jay," he heard her mumble, and it brought yet another smile to his face, a chuckle soon leaving his lips a moment later when he remembered what Jamie had teased him about. His father by choice never missed the opportunity to let him know that, though he wore a crown, he was still the boy who'd rode to Casterly Rock and had the piss taken out of those many years before. "The smiling king," he said softly, repeating Jamie's words as he leaned in and placed a kiss on his wife's forehead. He dressed as quietly as he could and yet woke her all the same. Sneaking off for a quick spar in the morning to start his day had become part of his routine, a legacy from his time at the Rock, no doubt, and though he and Jamie only sparred once a week, Jay still held the morning sessions with others now. Most mornings he was able to manage to be down and back before his wife awoke, It was not to be this morning, though it would seem. Jay? Marjorie asked, sitting up in their bed, and he felt his eyes widen as he looked at the covers that had fallen away, his wife's perfect body clearly on show. Go back to sleep, my love. I was just heading down to spar. You'll be back before I rise? She asked, and he moved to the bed, sitting down on it and looking into her eyes. I will, he said, kissing her softly as she lay back down. By the time he reached the door, she was asleep once more, and he wore that same silly smile that had led to Jamie's tease. Not that he cared or would wish it any other way. Later that day, they sat watching the tourney. The archery had been the day before, and the melee was today, and he found he had no desire to be there. Watching a tourney was boring, for him anyway, and as he looked around, he saw that others who weren't to take part felt the same. Barristan and Arthur would ride in the joust, as would Loras, while Jors, Walder, and Sir Richard Horp would take part in the melee. Jay looking to see that the 3 Kingsguard who weren't to fight today all looked as bored as he. Well, all except for Barristan, who at least was looking on with a keen eye in the hope of finding their 7th. When the rains began to pour down, Jay welcomed them. The day having taken a much better turn, and giving him the chance to go to her earlier than he had planned. They hurried from the tourney field, Jay's coat now off and covering Marjorie's hair as they made it to the carriages, and then headed back to the Red Keep. As they rode, he reached out, and soon she was on her way. Jay saw the disappointed look on his wife's face when he told her, and it was only later on that he realized what she may have planned for their day. Rhaenys is coming. Once we reach the Red Keep, I'll go to her, he said as his wife wiped her face. It's raining, Jay, Marjorie said, and he bit the inside of his cheek so as not to laugh. I can see that, he said, enjoying the little scowl she gave him as she finished wiping her face. I thought you'd go later on, before dinner? She asked with a note of disappointment in her voice. That was my plan. But this gives me more time with her, and I owe her as much time as anyone, more than that. But you said that you share things? Marjorie asked as she saw the regretful look on his face. We do, but it's like he tried to think of something that would make her understand. It's like the glass candles, and when we spoke with them, it's good to see each other and hear your voice, but it's not like being able to touch, Marjorie said, and how she said it made his heart beat a little faster. I touch, he said softly. When they arrived at the Red Keep, he kissed her goodbye and then directed the carriage to the Dragon Pit, Arthur riding with him, and he tried not to stare at the drenched night once they got there. There had been room in the carriage, but there was no way, other than a direct order from him, that Arthur wouldn't ride by its side. A Kingsguard needed to be seen to dissuade, as Barristan would say. Thankfully, when Rhaenys arrived, there were no arguments from the Sword of the Morning. This time was for him and Rhaenys alone, and where they'd be going to, he'd be more than safe. I'll be back at nightfall, Arthur. I'll be waiting, Your Grace. Not until then, I hope, he said, and Arthur smirked ever so slightly. No, not until then, Your Grace. Bidding the knight farewell, he walked to his sister and leaned in against her, the rain still falling down and steam coming from her scales where it hit her. Rhaenys was growing ever hotter to the touch, his sister's time near the Dragonmont affecting her and the other dragons in the most positive of ways. Climbing up onto her back, he strapped himself into the saddle, and then without a word she took to the sky. Jay could feel her own happiness beneath him as they flew, and his sister was in a playful mood, he found out, as she didn't head straight for Dragonstone. They instead flew over King's Landing itself, the Red Keep, the Great Sept, and Flea Bottom before heading out to Blackwater Bay, his sister seeming to be in no rush to head to Dragonstone, instead turning and heading inland, and soon they were flying towards Rosby and Duskendale, and finally out to sea once more. Rhaenys flew slowly over Driftmark, and even more slowly over Dragostone, Jay looking down on the island as they flew closer to the Dragonmont. She flew over the southern side and then down. It's northern. Jay seeing the cave long before they reached it. There were bones scattered around it, charred in various different sizes and shapes, whale and aurochs mainly, and he was happy to see that his sister was eating well. She moved into the cave and he followed. The lair his sister had made for herself was enormous, and though part of the Dragonmont, it felt not to be also. As if unlike other caves or lairs, this one had been made specifically for a dragon, rather than one a dragon had taken for its own. It was sung, Jai. This place, it was sung from stone. Rennick said, and he lay down beside her, feeling her head rest gently on his lap. Not truly, of course. His sister was holding her head away from him so it barely touched, but it was close enough so he could rub his hands on her face, and he heard her happy sounds as he did so. They sat quietly for some time. Jay knew what Rainix had been doing, as did she with him. It was something they shared together every night. This was different. It was them. And though he'd explained it as well as he could to Marjorie, it was even more than that. They needed the contact, to feel each other, and to touch each other. Their magic strengthened each other, and even were that not so, he had spent time with the rest of his family. She deserved his time more than any. The books, Jay. What you showed me, you truly think it can be done? She asked, and he looked deeply into her purple eyes. I think it's what I'm supposed to do, what we're supposed to do, he said as he brushed his hand close to her eye, watching as the large lid closed over. We, together we will. Bring the dawn, sister. The books made that clear. 3 heads of the dragon, Jaehaerys, Rhaenys, Rhaenix, only together can they bring the dawn and see that which was lost returned. The dragon must have 3 heads, Rhaenix said, and Jae looked at her. Valyria, sister. Together we'll rebuild Valyria and see our family live once more. But, Jae said, and Rhaenix roared her agreement. After spending time with his sister on Dragonstone, he'd arrived back to find his wife awake and waiting for him. That she was lying in their bed wearing a shift and reading a book shouldn't have been enough to inflame his passions, and yet it was. Jay, finding himself standing at the doorway and just taking her all in, each little movement she made was simple and yet incredibly arousing to him for some reason. As he looked at her, she'd wet her finger and turn a page, or bite her lips as she read something interesting. Occasionally, she'd brush her hair back when it fell across her face, and though she was well covered up, the small glimpses of her body were enough for him. When she had noticed his presence, he couldn't be sure, but the look she gave him was both one of annoyance and one he'd come to recognize. The thoughts that this was why she'd not slept were enough to excite him even more. Had that not been enough, then the way she placed the book on the table and then slowly removed her shift almost had him tearing his own clothing off, and he would have had she not demanded, no ordered, him to take them off slowly. Stop, she said, and he looked at her. Disrobe slowly, she said, biting her lip once more, and he smiled at her as he did as he was bid. Whether it was the newness of their being together in this way, or a sign that they were far better matched than most, they'd found they took great pleasure in each other's bodies. Not just in the things they did together, not just in the act itself, but in the looking, the touching, the soft caressing of each other, before, during, and after they'd lain together. Jay had found watching his wife remove her clothes to be just as arousing as when he removed them for her. Marjorie, he now knew, preferred for him to remove his own while she watched. So that's what he did, unfastening the buttons on the tunic, removing the tunic itself, his shirt, and then his boots. All of this, taking more than thrice the time it would normally take to remove them. As he even more slowly undid the laces of his breeches, he watched as Marjorie moved the covers to one side and lay back against the pillows. His wife looking like the maiden herself, and Jay finding his fingers wouldn't follow his commands as he stared at her. My husband likes what he sees, she asked, the smile on her face playful but true. Very much so. And never have I been so grateful for the gift of sight as much as I am when looking at my beautiful wife. All laugh. He fell almost short of breath when she ever so slightly parted her legs, Jay's eyes drawn to the soft brown hair she had at the junction of her thighs. Every inch of her was absolute perfection, he thought as he looked at her. The small little spot she had on her right breast, her pink nipples that were standing hard and seeking his attention, her legs, and what lay between them. He almost laughed when she raised her eyebrow and then pointed with one of her fingers at his breeches. Off, she said, her voice a little huskier now, and he was glad he'd affected her as much as she had him. Another thing he was more than thankful for finding out since they'd married. It was no surprise to him that he was already fully erect, nor that he saw the almost involuntary narrowing of her eyes when she looked at his manhood. Once he took the breeches off, he moved closer, but not to the bed. He stood almost at the end, but not quite, as he moved his hand down his stomach and saw Marjorie squeeze her legs together. When he took his cock into his hand, he saw her bite her lip a little harder, and when he began to move it up and down, her nostrils flared ever so slightly. "Come to bed," she said. And he climbed up, his hand soon replaced by her own, as his fingers began to explore her body instead of his. Their tongues fought for dominance, both of them as eager as the other to direct their attention to what they wished for. When he moved his mouth from hers, he felt her hand leave him and reach up to grip his head, almost dragging him back to kiss her more. He allowed her to think she'd won for only a moment before moving to kiss her neck rather than her lips, Marjorie's fingers almost pulling his hair out when he bit her softly on her neck. Soon, though her hands were directing his head to where she wanted, her lips, her chin, her chest, and finally her breasts, Marjorie moaning when he took her nipple in his mouth and bit on it gently. His hands weren't idle either. As he softly licked and tugged on one nipple with his teeth, he rolled the other between his thumb and forefinger, his other hand slowly stroking down the outside of her leg. Moving to the other nipple, he did the same. Though this time, when his hand slid down her leg, he changed direction, Marjorie stiffening when his fingers touched her hip and when they slid over the front of her thigh, and then when they moved up the inside of it. He felt her legs part some more, and then she moaned loudly when his hand finally reached its destination. "Jay," she called out as he touched her wetness, his fingers brushing over her gently. He bit her nipple a little harder, and she raised up slightly from the bed, his finger slipping inside of her, making her moan once more. When he moved his hand away, he felt her own try to reach his, but there was no need. He wasn't finished. He'd not even started. He found her nub, not by any great feat of knowledge of her body, but by sheer luck, and the moan she gave him as his fingers began to move it in a circle was the greatest reward he could have asked for. Around and around, once to the left and once to the right, his fingers moving in alternate directions as Marjorie's hips began to rise. The small shudder and loud exhale of breath was just the beginning, he knew, and when he slipped his fingers inside her and began to move them in and out, he felt she was on the verge of a much larger release. Moving down from her nipple, were he not so intent and focused on what he was about to do, then he'd have laughed at her hands pushing the top of his head. He knew she both wished him to hurry and not, and so he decided to compromise, moving faster than he would normally do, but slower than she wished. When he reached the soft patch of hair, he blew on it gently, before watching as his fingers did their work. She moaned once more when he withdrew them, and then again when he used both hands to spread her open. The sight before him, one he'd never tire of, no matter if he lived to his Uncle Eamon's age. His tongue moved of its own accord, and then he was tasting her. Nothing in the world came even close, and he savored every single lick his tongue made. He pushed it inside and stressed it as deep as he could go, feeling her hands grip his hair tightly once more. Then he withdrew it and licked all the way up to her nub, and her hands shot back and slammed on the bed. "Jay, please," she cried out, and he looked up to see the need in her eyes. It was a need he shared, and one he'd see satisfied for both their sakes. His tongue flicked her nub from side to side, his fingers slipping inside once more, and as he took her nub in his mouth As his fingers curled up inside her, he began to suck down, and he felt the pressure build. J. Jonas. Jae, she said louder than the other 2 times, and he knew then she was close. She shuddered as she called out his name, his fingers still moving as her hips lifted from the bed and crashed down again and again. He moved his mouth from her nub as he looked up to see that her eyes were closed, his fingers coming out slowly and carefully, and then he softly kissed her between her legs once more. Then he began to lay softer kisses on her body until he reached her neck. Knowing his wife better now than he had when they'd first done this, Jay lay back on the bed and took her in his arms, feeling her snuggle against him. Once she'd had her release, Marjorie was sensitive to being touched down there. Their coupling afterward had caused her some discomfort and not as much pleasure as he'd wished to give her. It was something they'd learned together, something they knew now that they did not then. And so rather than seek his own pleasure right away, he'd lay with her, hold her, and wait until she was ready for him to do so. His hand sought his cock, which had withered some, no longer as hard as it had once been, but not fully soft either. It didn't take long until it was back to his former state, and when he felt his wife's tongue in his ear and her hand brushing his own away so she could wrap her fingers around him, he stiffened even more. "So ready for me," she whispered, and then he felt her gently bite his ear. "So ready for me," she said once more, and he knew their night had only just begun. Beyond the wall, 298 AC, Kinvara. The new babe was doing well, and it had certainly helped with her welcome into the camp. Though she was still not fully trusted, she knew. Some had questioned her on her god, and asked her or her men to show them what they could do with fire. But other than when she'd wished to light a fire to look into the flames, she'd not done as they'd asked. That it had led to Val being annoyed with her was understandable, she supposed, the woman now being considered a liar by some who'd not seen what they could do. But R'hllor's gifts were not a mummery, not some act or illusion, and though she knew that some in her order used mummery to spread his word, she would not. She, Benero, Mokoro, Melisandre, and even Thoros of Myr were gifted by their god to help the prince and to fight the war for the dawn. To become nothing more than a mummer who did parlor tricks would be to spit in R'hllor's eyes, and only a fool would dare do that. So instead she'd kept to herself and waited for the answer to the questions and offer the prince had made the king beyond the wall. An offer that only Jaehaerys could make and carry through, and one that Mance had not believed to be true. "You're saying he'll let us through the wall?" Mance asked after reading the letter. "No, my prince is," she said in reply. "Why? Because here you'll die. All of you. You'll die and rise once more, and when you do, then my prince will be fighting a larger army than the one which already comes his way." "You know of the White Walkers?" Dalla asked. "I know many things, Dalla. I know that he comes and seeks to end all life. Men, women, children. I know that the free folk can't stand against him alone. I know that should he win, then Westeros, Essos, Sothorios, Ulthos, nowhere will be safe from him. He will cover the world in dead men, and none shall escape him," she said, looking to the woman who looked worried. "Now, I also know my prince will bring the dawn," she said with a smile. "How? The Targaryens hold no power in Westeros?" Mance asked. "My prince will either already be or soon become king of the lands south of the wall. He has woken dragons from stone and possesses a power that makes my own seem like the briefest flicker of a candle against the light of the sun. He has done this before reaching 6 and 10 name days because he is the prince that was promised the song of ice and fire. That he'd not accepted her words or the words of the prince himself outright was to be expected. But he had to make a choice, and make a choice soon. Cold winds were rising further north, and Kinvara didn't need the flames to see them. What she did need the flames for was to help these people as well as she could. And so it was with that thought that she, her men, and a number of the free folk walked from the camp to try and find things that would help them. The flames had shown her that there were some at the fist of the first men, knives, arrowheads, spear tips, enough to arm 20 or 30 men. But she could not risk traveling so far. There were some buried much nearer, not as many as at the fist, but some, and though with her god's and prince's favor these people would be gone before the dead arrived, it wouldn't hurt to be prepared. Val, Tormund, Ygritte, and a warg called Oral had joined with her own 2 guards, each of them eager to find whatever it was the crazy witch had told them was there. Tormund having been embarrassed when he'd noticed she'd been listening to his conversation with Val and heard him call her that. It took them half a day to reach their destination, and another hour or 2 once there to find where to dig. Kinvara looked on as her men broke the ground and dug down a few feet. That the free folk with her were skeptical was no great surprise, though she was pleased to see that Val seemed keener to believe her. The distance that had grown between them since she'd come to camp, not one she enjoyed. When it was dug up, Kinvara looked eagerly at the sheet, watching as her men opened it up to reveal what was hidden. We came here for this? Ygritte said dismissively while picking up one of the knives. This can kill the dead, these. Kinvara said, picking up the arrows. And these. She took one of the knives in her hand. Can kill their masters. Nothing can kill a White Walker, nothing. If you see one, you run, as we do, Orell said. We do not flee, she said simply, as her men handed out one of the knives and some arrowheads to Ygritte, who now seemed eager for them. When she arrived back at the camp, it was to Mance's tent. She went with the rest of the weapons, finding the man holding his babe while Dalla cooked some stew. Once he saw her, he placed the babe in the crude crib they made for him and turned to see what it was she brought. Val, explaining what they were and where they'd found them. Mance held one of the knives in his hand a few moments later, turning it over and looking at it as if it was something he'd seen before, and it made her curious enough to ask him about it. You know this thing? She said, and he nodded. Aye, obsidian. Dragonglass, some call it. The old maester at the wall would speak of it often. How strange a substance it was, and how the dragon lords of old used to carry some of it on them at all times until they did not. You knew Aemon Targaryen? She asked. Aye, a good man. And should his grandnephew be like him, then mayhaps we have a chance, Mance said with a soft smile. You think the offer true? Val asked. True enough to consider. I want you to go with Kinvara, Val. Travel beyond the wall, go south, and take the measure of this prince, this king. See if his words, when spoken, carry the same promise as those written. Brast, Mance said, looking to his good sister. And should they? Val asked. Then we arrange a parley and see what the offer truly entails. We cannot fight a man with dragons. All we can do is hope he fights alongside us. Go, seek him out and speak to him. Kinvara, I'm sure, can get you an audience with a king, he said, looking to her. I can, she said. Then you both leave on the morrow. You'll need to change, Val, to blend in. Mance said with a smirk. I'm not dressing like a fucking kneeler, Val said angrily. You must. You don't need to kneel, but to go past the wall you need to be just like Kinvara, Dalla said, and Kinvara saw Mance was on the verge of laughing aloud. The laughter did come the next day, from Tormund, Ygritte, and from many others once they saw how Val was dressed. Though to Kinvara's eyes, Val looked every inch a red priestess while wearing one of her dresses, that she was absolutely freezing in it, only making her look angrier than she did normally. The next one who says a fucking word, I'll gut here and now, Val said loudly, the laugh soon stopping. Kinvara watched as Val said her goodbyes to her sister and nephew, to Mance, and to some of the others. Mance then walked over to her and handed her a note, A smaller letter than the one the prince had written, but from one king to another. For your prince. I hope we meet again, Kinvara. But should we not, I thank you for my son. Mance said warmly. We will meet again, Mance Raider, though the next time I'll be standing by my prince's side. Until then, I wish you good fortune, and I ask my God to keep you in his good graces. I'll take all the help I can get, be it from gods, men, princes, or priestesses. They rode out of the camp without looking back, Val seeming afraid to do so, and Kinvara, because she had no need to. She would return here, and once she did it would be under a dragon's protection. She, Val, and the free folk, all of them would be. She would return here, King's Landing, 298 AC, the melee, Brienne. She had not truly fought during the war for the throne, nor had she spent as much of it by Sir Walder's side as she had hoped. Here today, both of those things would change. She knew as she looked up as the herald announced some of the competitors. She, along with Craig and Snow, were amongst the youngest of them. The vast majority of the others were men who'd fought not just in the last war, but in the ones before it also. Despite being from the Stormlands, Brienne stood with men and women of the north, the Small and Great Johns, Maega Mormont, and two of her daughters, Cregan, who was to be named the new Lord of Sea Dragon Point. There were men and women of Dorne, too, Sir Daemon Sand and Prince Oberyn's daughters, and the prince himself to everyone's delight. Besides, Sir Walder stood the other two Kingsguards who'd be competing, Sir Richard Horpe and Sir Jorah Whitewolf, all three wearing their Kingsguard armor and having their king look down proudly upon them. There were men of the 100, too, Sir Jareth and Sir Mark, men from the Riverlands, three of the new Lord Paramount's sons, Brynden, Lucas, and Hoster, along with Harry Rivers, the supposed bastard son of Lord Bracken. Then there were the men of the Vale, Lord Yon, his heir Sir Andar, and second son Sir Robar. All were taking part, as were Lord Beric Dondarrion and Thoros of Myr, along with Sir Roland Storm, who represented the Stormlands among others, while the West had the Strongboar, his father, and Sir Adam Marbrand. Perhaps the oddest pair out there, though, was the two representing the Princess of Dragonstone, the Hound, and a man she knew little of that was named Strong Belwas. Your Graces, my lords and ladies, good men of King's Landing, Westeros and beyond, welcome to the Grand Melee. The herald shouted, and then as soon as he was done, the fighting began. The first man she faced was a fellow Stormlander, a man representing Housewan and who swung a mean-looking morning star. Brienne easily dodged his strikes, though, the man using far too much strength and not enough skill in his movements. Brienne easily dodged his strikes, though, after allowing him to overextend. She kicked his legs from under him and watched as he crumbled to the ground. His day was done as he yielded a moment later, and she moved on to her next fight. She didn't have far to look, as apparently the man she'd beaten had some friends, and two of them took his defeat to a woman badly. What are you doing fighting here? Shouldn't you be off birthing, babes? The taller, uglier of the two said with a sneer. Leave it out, Errol. What man would lay with someone who looked like that? The other said mockingly. There was a time when she'd have felt the pain of those words. A time when she'd have let her anger and feelings of unworthiness overwhelm her. She was no longer that girl, though. That girl had no friends, and few who believed her as able as any many to wield her sword. Brienne could count the king himself among those who considered her a friend, and who believed her to be capable. Jay, Loras, and Sir Walder all believed in her, and so she did too. The swing of her sword caught the first man so much by surprise that the yield after it was a foregone conclusion. Brienne smirked as she saw the expression on both men's faces change. One looked abashed and ashamed, the other fearful. It was to the latter. She moved, and though he put up a better fight than either of his friends, soon he was on his knees yielding, and Brienne heard a voice call out to him. Maybe next time you'll remember that women can fight too," the voice said, and she turned to see Prince Oberyn give her a bow before taking his spear and moving elsewhere for his own fight. That the men she'd just beaten didn't offer up apologies for their words proved them to be exactly what she thought they were. It mattered not, though, as she moved on to find her next opponent and took a quick look around the ring. Watching Walder wield an axe was, she thought, a thing of beauty, though compared to watching Prince Oberyn spin his spear, it perhaps came second. Brienne moved to back up her knight as she watched Prince Oberyn toy with some man from the Stormlands, obviously one who bore a grudge for the defeat by the Dornish army and their prince. She chuckled at the idea that this fool thought himself capable of finding his satisfaction in defeating the clearly playing with him Oberyn. "My lady, shall we?" she heard a man say from behind her, and turned to find herself facing one of Lord Royce's sons. "Sir Robar, why not?" she said, and the man smiled at her as they took their stances. Oberyn. He had not intended to fight in the melee, but he got bored, and when he got bored, he did things to relieve that boredom. Besides, it was fun to see the jealous look he got from his nephew when he'd announced it that morning. That he kept looking up and offering a bow to Jay each time he beat someone was no doubt rubbing it in a little. But it amused him, and the scowls he was receiving back each time he did so were worth it. After watching the Lady of Tarth beat 3 men as if they were nothing, Oberyn found himself faced with a fool from the Stormlands who came seeking revenge. Just quite how this man thought he'd actually managed to get some was beyond him. His talent with his sword passable at best. Still, Oberyn found amusement in making him look bad, spinning away easily from any attempt the man made at hitting him, keeping him at bay with his spear as he turned to face him. Eventually, upon seeing a nicer, more worthy target, Oberyn had enough, and so, with 3 moves of his spear, a strike to the man's middle, a feint to his head, and then using the shaft of the spear to take his legs from under him, it was done. "And I thought Stormlanders could fight," he said with a snort after the man had yielded. He moved away and looked at the man he would be facing, the new Lord Paramount of the Vale, and a man whose loyalty to Jay he was unsure of. Jan Royce looked at a fight to his side. Sir Robar, his second son, and Lady Brienne had started to fight each other when Oberyn was playing with the Stormlander. Now they were fighting side by side against 3 Riverlanders. "Your son is impressive," Oberyn said. And it was true, Sir Robar had come along well. "As is the lady, my prince," Jan said, looking to his spear and raising his morning star. "Shall we? Why not? Today seems as good a day for it as any," he said with a chuckle which the Lord of Runestone returned. While he had the edge in speed and reach, Jan had him beat on strength and, dare he say it, experience. Oberyn still remembering watching as the man had beat all in Harrenhal those very many years ago. That he had beaten Robert Baratheon to victory in that melee was a little-known fact. The stories that had been told about the Stag King for years later always naming him the Warrior Reborn, something he was anything but. When he had time to think of things from back then, and when those thoughts were not of Elia and his niece and nephew, Oberyn would think long and hard on the trident. In his mind, Rhaegar was a far superior warrior than Robert, and while that didn't always lead to a win, given the stakes it really should have, sometimes, when in his cups, Oberyn would imagine it was he facing the so-called demon of the trident. Even back then he'd have been able to take him, he believed. As he moved to face Jan Royce, though he tried not to let it, his mind was making this victory to be about proving one that could never have been. He thrust with his spear, and Jan brushed it away, getting inside Oberyn's guard for a moment, and then almost catching him with a swing to the head. Oberyn jumped back and brought the spear around in an arc, forcing Jan to duck before Oberyn brought the spear down hard, the shaft catching the older man's shoulder. Seeing him wince, Oberyn increased the pace of his swings faster and faster, and forcing Jan to almost run away to keep out of their range. The blow which he was hit with caught him completely by surprise and almost cost him the day. Jan, having thrown a tourney dagger in either desperation or a pre-planned move. "An interesting trick," he said as he rolled away and wiped the blood from his lip. "One tries, my prince," Jan said as he swung at him again. This time Oberyn was the one on the defensive, using the shaft of the spear to deflect the blows and trying to find both respite and an opening while he did. It took him some time to do so, and he had to give it to the older man. Not once did Jan breathe heavily or falter in his attacks. On and on he came, the blows barely missing, and the kick Oberyn caught him with a shin was so unexpected, the man almost dropped his morning star. A moment later he did just that as Oberyn brought the spear crashing down on his arm before he then spun holding the tip of it to Jan's throat. "I yield," Jan said. And Oberyn nodded. "I thank you, my lord. An excellent fight," he said with a bow, and Jan nodded before walking away. Oberyn looked to see Daemon and Obara were fighting against all three Mormont ladies, and he smirked before looking up to his nephew once more. By the time he was walking to face his next opponent, he was laughing loudly. Jay's hands had gripped his seat tightly, and his face was angry as he looked at him. Oberyn, knowing it was annoyance that he was fighting while he could not, that was truly what bothered his nephew. Perhaps he shouldn't make so much fun of him while he did it, he thought before he laughed and shook his head. "Where's the fun in that?" he said softly. "Help! Mage." These people were no competition, she thought, as her mace caught yet another head. She hadn't even been aiming for the man's head. It was supposed to be a feint, and she swore the man had actually head-butted her mace rather than face her properly. Damn southern softies, she thought as she moved on to the next one. 3, 4, 5 men. And she'd not been tested once, Mage looking around to see if there was anyone worth a damn to fight in this ring. Seeing the great and small John, she was sorely tempted to crack her mace against John Umber's skull or against Goatsbane's, but they'd agreed not to fight each other until there were only true opponents left on the field. That was when she saw them. The 2 Dornish girls and the Dornish knight, 3 on 2, and the 2 they were facing just happened to be her daughters. Meigay smiled as she hurried to even the odds, only to find that by the time she got there, the prettier of the 2 Dornish girls had already yielded. She would have turned and left, as the odds were now fair. She was actually in the process of doing so when the prince's daughter signed her own doom. "Oh, did you girls send for mother? Look, Daemon, it's 3 little bears, Mama Bear and her cubs," she said. And Mage looked to see that at least the Dornish knight looked displeased by the girl's words. "Aye, it is, and you little girl are about to find out what happens when you make a bear angry." Phoo. While Daemon faced off against Jory and Lyra, Mage looked at the spear in Obara San's hand and smirked. She quickly dodged out of the way of a strike, and then she went on the offensive. Though she didn't put everything into her swings, she did put power into them, and Obara struggled to keep her spear in her hands each time Mage connected with her mace. Behind her, Daemon was using her 2 girls against each other, moving and deflecting blows from one to the other. Obara was having no such success against her, and Mage moved in and swung even harder, the girl looking unshocked as the spear crashed to the ground. To give her credit, Obara pulled out a set of knives, and at first took up a stance to face her with them, only to realize it was no use, and so she then threw them at her instead. Mage easily swatted them away with her mace, and saw that the girl had been smart enough to use it as a distraction. As she looked on, she saw Obara roll and try to reach the spear, but she was too fast for her. Obara's hands had already gripped the shaft, but Mage's foot on the spear stopped her from lifting it up. When the girl turned her head, it was to face the mace, and she nodded her yield, a small smile on her face as she did so. "I thank you for the fight, Lady Mormont," Obara said when Mage lifted her foot from the spear. "And I you, Obara." Mage turned to see that Jory and Daemon were helping Lyra, who had a cut over her eye. Moving quickly to them, she found that while Jory and Daemon had yielded, Lyra had not. The cut, though not terrible, would be enough to end her day, and that her daughter was pissed about it only showed the bear that she was. Lady Mage. She heard the accented voice behind her. Prince Oberyn, she said, turning to face him. It seems the Dorne and the North are destined to be the end of each other this day. So what say you? Shall we give my nephew a show? Oberyn said with a smile. Aye, why not? She said, raising her mace. Finally, a worthy opponent to face, she thought, as steel clashed against steel. Sandor, he was a fat fucker, but the man could eat, drink, and most especially fight. And though he'd never admitted to anyone, Sandor quite liked Belwas. Together they'd beaten more than 10 men, and he knew that tonight they'd drink and eat, and the fat fuck would annoy and amuse him at the same time. Just as he had at the wedding feast, he thought, as he looked, as Belwas once again tried to cut himself with a blunted blade. I told you, there's no fucking edge on your blade, you stupid fucker, he said, glaring at the man. Why fight with no edge? You people make no sense to Strong Belwas, just like you not eating the locusts that do not fly. Strong Belwas said, a confused look on his face. They're fucking cockroaches, you fool. They're not fucking locusts, and pouring honey on them doesn't make them taste any fucking better, he said, not wanting to have this argument once again. That, my friend, is where you are wrong. Honey makes everything better, Strong Belwas said as he laughed loudly. Well, I hope you brought honey for these two fuckers, Sandor said as the Great and Small Johns came their way. Sandor gripped his great sword and looked on as Belwas did the same to his Arak, or what passed for one here. He even chuckled a little when Belwas slapped his belly and then once again made as if he was cutting it. Each scar represented the man he'd killed, Belwas had told him, and though he'd found his reasoning for doing so to himself odd, it was clear looking at them that he'd killed even more men than he. Clegane, Strong, the Great John sighed. Are we going to fucking do this, or what? He growled and saw the smirk on the Great John's face. Which of you is to face Goatsbane? The Small John cried out, and this time, Sandor did chuckle when Strong Belwas slapped his belly. I will. I've brought the honey for you, Belwas said, winking at him, and the confused look on the two northerners' faces was something he'd remember for a long time. As was the fight itself, the sound of the two great swords colliding together was loud, and the sheer force they hit each other would have taken the swords from the hands of lesser men. But he and the Great John both had the strength to spare, and so their swords slammed against each other over and over, neither man giving an inch. On and on they fought, long after Belwas won, and he saw the man look at him concernedly, his eyes willing him either to win or give him permission to join in and help. It would turn that neither was to happen this day. The blow which caught him certainly broke a rib. The blood he spat up a clear sign of that. He tried to retaliate, his sword coming back hard, but the sheer effort of the swing had him coughing up more. That the Great John then just patted it away was disconcerting, and that the man didn't respond with a swing of his own, much appreciated. Instead, he simply took the sword from his hand with a blow to his shoulder, and moments later, Sandor yielded. He nodded to his friend that he was well, though he knew he'd need to see the maester to be sure, and that Dany would certainly make him do so. The Great John, though, had given up all he had in beating him too, as even before Sandor had left the field, Belwas had taken his revenge for him. Sandor tried not to laugh when Belwas slapped his belly once more, as he found it hurt to do so. There were 8, maybe 9 men left out of the almost 100 who'd entered. His defeat was no shame, not with the men who were still out there, and that 2 of the princess's men had made it so far would reflect well on her. As he finally left the field, Sandor spat out a bit more blood and found himself feeling the pain in his mouth. It made him feel better knowing that was where the blood was coming from and not deeper inside, though he did feel a bit of a fool for having bitten the inside of his cheek. Walder. Sir George and Sir Richard had fought well, both making it to the last dozen or so competitors. That both had in the end fallen to the same blade was a surprise, and he wondered if Barristan was watching Sir Robar as much as he had been. Walder had seen it first when the man had faced off against Brienne, something he was now doing once more as their first fight had been interrupted. He looked as Prince Oberyn faced off against Roland Storm, the prince having beaten Maege Mormont in a fight for the ages. As for him, his opponent was one he'd not expected to fight, having thought the Strongboar would have been too much for Cregan only to have proved wrong. Still, he'd rather face him than the crazy priest whose flaming blade looked and felt much different than it once had. That it gave Thoros extra belief was a worrying thing, and as he and Strong Belwas ready to fight, Walder wondered who would carry this day. "You've done well, Cregan, just like your namesake," he said, seeing the boy nod. Shame Jay couldn't fight today. We'd have been able to recreate the Dragon Knight's fight," Cregan said. "You really wish to lose that badly?" he asked, and Cregan chuckled. "Shall we, Sir Walder, for the North?" Cregan said. "Aye, my lord, for the North," he said, seeing the smile grow ever brighter. His axe and his size gave him the strength and the reach. But just like in his spars with Jay, Cregan had speed and technique on his side. The boy's longsword was everywhere and nowhere, and while he didn't use as many spins as his king, he threw in just as many feints and laid just as many traps for him to fall into. The main issue the boy had, though, was the difference in strength. Though Cregan landed blows, they were easily able to be absorbed. Walder could see it was frustrating the boy, and he took full advantage of that frustration. He began to use his axe to thrust, not to swing, taking the blows he got in return, but landing more and more of his own also. It allowed him to move closer, and he purposely faltered in his stance, which gave Cregan an opening, or so the boy thought. Instead of sweeping Walder's legs to take him down as Cregan had thought he'd been in a position to do, it was a smack of his head that the boy got for his trouble, and that was to be the end of his day. As Cregan staggered back, Walder thrust the head of his axe once more, and the boy fell. He moved quickly and stood on his sword before lowering his axe to his neck. "I yield, Sir Walder," Cregan said. And Walder helped him back to his feet. "You fought well, the final 8, Cregan. Look at those around you and feel proud of that achievement. You deserve to," he said softly, and Cregan nodded before looking his way. He looked to see that Brienne had yielded, as had Strong Belwas. They were down to 4, and while he'd much prefer to face Sir Robar than the others, it was not to be, with Thoros instead moving to face the Vale Knight. Walder turned to see Oberyn move his way, the prince spinning his spear and smiling all the while, and Walder decided to do the same with his axe, watching as Oberyn laughed when he reached him. "Sir Walder," Oberyn said. "My prince," he replied. The spear moved even more quickly than Cregan's sword had. The blade, had it been sharpened, would be hard to avoid. As it was, the blunted nature of it meant it didn't need to be. Walder, finding that just as with Cregan, he could take and absorb the blows aimed his way. The swings and having the spear crashing down on him were more problematic, though, and Oberyn was having his own problems with Walder's axe too. Damn, but the man was fast, and Walder was finding air when there should have been a body there to receive the blow. Oberyn had something else in common with his nephew too, spins. He used them both for defense and offense, spinning away from his axe and back into range to attack and hit him once again. When he finally did get a blow to actually connect, it was a glancing one. The damage not as much as it could have been, but it was enough to create an opening. Walder moved quickly so that the prince couldn't get away, Oberyn rolling on the ground as the axe came down again and again. Finally, he'd had enough, and as he thrust his axe forward, he decided to do something unexpected. He pushed hard and let it go. Oberyn had jumped back to avoid the thrust, but the axe being thrown as part of the move had caught him by surprise. As the prince tried to shake off the blow, he was caught with another, this one a clubbing forearm across the back, and the match was done. Using the prince's now fallen spear, Walder got the yield and helped a shaken Prince Oberyn to his feet. "Now that I didn't expect," Oberyn said, shaking off the effects of both blows. "Which is why the day is mine, my prince," he said to a laugh. "Perhaps our friend with the flaming sword may disagree," Oberyn said, and Walder turned and grimaced, seeing that not only had Thoros won, but he'd done so in far less time than Walder had. Bending down, he picked up his axe and turned to face the man and his flaming sword. As soon as it came near him, he knew two things. The flames on the sword were true, and he feared them greatly. Each time they came near connecting with him, Walder would almost shrink to avoid their heat. Unlike the green they had once been, these were a more natural flame. And as for the man himself, Thoros seemed to enjoy wielding this blade far more than ever before. Whether the flames made the man or the man made the flames was a question for another day, as Walder soon felt the heat of them on the hand that he held his axe in. Instinctively, he pulled his hand away only for the flaming sword to move close to his face, and he knew then he was done. "I yield," he said, and Thoros nodded, Walder looking on as he placed the sword tip down in the dirt and the flames were extinguished. King's Landing, 298 AC. Amen. He'd quite enjoyed the melee and knew his nephew both had and had not, though he'd cheered the victor and had smiled much more than he had scowled. Aemon had watched as Brienne of Tarth had been defeated by the Royce lad, the way she wielded a sword so reminiscent of Duncan that he'd felt himself almost traveling back in time. While Sir Walder didn't use a sword, he did possess a lot of the same qualities as his famous ancestor once had. Aemon now sure that he, Brienne, and the two large men who guarded Lady Olenna were in fact blood kin to Duncan the Tall. After he noticed it and looked through both the lineages of the Grey Houses and through both the listing in the Book of Brothers in White Sword Tower, he'd then looked through notes on Egg and Duncan's adventures. Some he'd known, of course, Ashford Meadow, Dorne, and when he and Egg had come to visit him in Old Town after their time there. In Egg's letters to him that he still kept, he had spoken of Standfast and Duncan's attraction to Lady Rohan and of their time at White Walls. There were few with such a storied life as his brother's closest friend, and while most of the tales were famous, most of his dalliances were far less so. Egg having been embarrassed more than once upon entering to ready his knight for the day, only to find that Duncan had found someone to share his bed. Common folk, noble ladies, married women, and those unpromised, Duncan bedded many and shamed none. It had been harder to confirm the two giant guards were his, and yet not so much. Once you knew where to look, the only thing that now remained was to speak to them all about it. "I wish you to take this note to Lady Olenna's guards, the giants," he said to a serving girl who hurried to do as he had bid. Aemon, looking to see the girl do just as he had asked, and he saw one of the two large men look his way. That Lady Olenna did likewise was to be expected, and he'd not meant to do it so publicly. But they would be heading back to the Red Keep soon, and he'd wish for a meeting before or during the night's feast. As for Brienne and Sir Walder, his nephew would help with that, and once he had a time when the twins could come and see him, he'd see to the other two as well. As they ready to ride back, he got his answer. They'd come to him before the night's feast, and Aemon walked to speak to Jaehaerys before then. His nephew was as usual listening keenly as his wife spoke about something, and it brought a smile to his face to see them both so clearly happy in their marriage. He'd been lucky to find someone so well suited, and it put him in mind yet again of both his own mother and of Egg's wife Betha. Though his father had been an unforgiving man, his mother had always brought the best out of him while she'd lived, and Egg's own words about Betha had always stuck with him. "I'm married for love, not duty, and it was the one time that I truly felt the God's favor." Looking at his nephew, he felt that he too felt the God's favor in his choice of bride, and for that he was grateful. He waited until they were finished speaking and then walked over before they got into their carriage, Jaehaerys looking at him curiously as he did so. Uncle, Sir Walder and Lady Brienne, your grace, can you ask them to meet me before the feast? He said, using the title in case anyone overheard. Is there anything wrong, Uncle? No, your grace. There's just something I'd like to discuss with them. Of course, Uncle. I'll speak to them both, J. Harries said, looking at him with that same curious look. After riding back and heading to his rooms, Aemon prepared the evidence he'd gathered that proved his point. He knew, had he told anyone what he wished to do, they'd look at him oddly. They'd no doubt wonder why he was going so far on something that perhaps would mean nothing to those he was about to tell. But it meant something to him. Duncan had protected his brother and his family. He'd saved Princess Rhaella, allowing her to give birth to Rhaegar, and had gone back inside when others would not. For a Kingsguard, there was no greater honor than to die for your king, and Duncan was one of the few who'd done so beside theirs. Time stretched on, and then Brienne and Sir Walder arrived first, the twins arriving almost an hour after they did. Aemon finding out that Lady Olenna wished to know why both of them needed to go to this meeting. The Queen of Thorns was curious, no doubt, as to the nature of it. Looking at all four in the room, any doubts he'd ever had that they were kin would be dispelled most easily. That all four seemed to know each other and had some camaraderie boded well, too. I know you may wonder why I called you here. He began only for Sir Walder to speak. You wish to talk about Duncan, Sir Walder said, and Brienne and the twins looked to him and then to Aemon. You know, he asked. My grandmother told me who I was before I left Winterfell, Sir Walder said. Who you were? No, Brienne asked. Sir Duncan the Tall was my great-grandfather. Walder said to shocked looks. He was kin to you all, he said as all four looked his way. What? How can that be? Eric asked. The shield, what father said, Eric said while Brienne looked at the three men and then at him. I can show you the evidence should you wish it. Eric, Arik, and Walder here are Duncan's great-grandsons. You, Brienne, are his twice great-granddaughter. All four of you share the blood of one of the greatest knights in Westeros, a man who served my brother with honor right up until they both died. You, Sir Walder, have been serving my nephew for many years. You, Brienne, have been doing likewise, Aemon said. We have not, Eric said sadly. No, but you've been serving his queen's family just as diligently, have you not? Aemon said to Nods. Why did you wish us to know this? Brienne asked and then realized her tone may be taken wrongly. Not that I take issue with any of you being my kin, she quickly added. Sir Duncan was a good man. His legacy, I had thought, was the life he'd led, what he'd done for my brother and what he'd done in Summerhall. But I was wrong. You, each of you, are his legacy. Each of you should be proud of him and of yourselves, too. Take comfort in the fact that you are kin, that you are family. Listen to a man who'd once thought himself to be the last of his own. There is no greater joy in knowing that you're not alone in this world. And while you have other kin, does it not feel a relief to know there is more? They didn't need to answer. And later that night, at the feast after Aemon had spoken to J. Harris to see it so, Lady Olenna now guarded by a king's guard and royal guard for one night, instead of her two giant ones. As he sat in his seat and looked out, as he spoke to Shiera, to Dany, and to Jaehaerys and Tyrion, Aemon looked to see the four of them sitting together laughing and japing at stories they were telling each other. He looked at them, and he smiled, remembering the giant who'd come to visit him, and that he'd taken the measure of so many years earlier. King's Landing, 298 AC, Jaehaerys Targaryen. He'd been surprised that Thoros had won until Walder had told him about the flames on his sword, something that he'd resolved to speak to Melisandre and Thoros himself about, though he and others had been even more surprised by the efforts of Sir Robar in the melee. The knight made it to the final four, much to his father's delight. Jay had asked Barristan if he'd missed something. Had the man faced an easier path, or being lucky somehow, his Lord Commander telling him that he had not? A Vale knight would politically be good, and one talented with a blade would be a welcome addition to the King's Guard. Sir Barristan didn't just seem to agree, but he had suggested it, and Jay asked him to arrange a meeting with the knight himself. It wasn't the only meeting being arranged, it would seem, as his uncle Aemon wished to speak to Sir Walder and Brienne. Even that, not the last meeting people wished to attend, his uncle and brother both wishing to speak to Theon before his sentence was carried out. As he dressed for the night's feast, he thought on his own meetings that were soon to come, the private trials that weren't to be so open where sentences had already been decided, Riverland's lords, Vale lords, men who'd fought against him and who had only bent the knee when they'd been defeated. The line between fairness and being too forgiving was one he feared he'd get wrong. That his uncle, his new lord's paramount, and his own inclinations were one thing, while his wife's, his family's, and his other uncles were quite another, had been something he'd found an even tougher line to worry about. In the end, though practicality won the day, and though they'd lose lands, it would, in the purse, he truly hurt them. Blood debts were owed and were to be collected and then put to use, and his plans had need of coin. Yet truthfully, it was another set of meetings he was thinking on, ones he'd done everything he could to free up his schedule so as to make room for. Meetings with his sisters, time spent doing what each of them wished, sparring with Arya, and finally taking her up on Rhaenys's back. Time with Sansa doing whatever it was that pleased her most, be it just sitting and talking or singing her some songs, maybe a walk through the gardens, which was something she seemed to enjoy according to his good lady wife. With Joy it was easy. Apples and Winter would ride and they'd race outside the gates once more. Each of them would get a day at least. King or no, he'd see it done. "You're not ready yet?" Marjorie said, and he turned to look at her and frown. How had she managed to dress so quickly? "I may have got distracted," he said, and she looked at him with a smirk on her face. "And I wasn't even in the room," she said, making him chuckle. "Had it been you that distracted me so, dear wife, then I'd have come to distract you back," he said as he took her hand in his. "Then whom has my husband been thinking of, and should I worry that it's not me?" Marjorie said, her laughter light as he raised her hand and spun her into his arms. "While I was thinking of other women, these I think I'm allowed. My sisters." "My sisters," he said as he kissed her neck and felt her move against him. "Aye, those I'll allow, they and your aunts, but only them." "J. Harry's Targaryen, am I understood?" she said, trying to look serious and failing as she laughed one more. "And I'd ask my wife the same, though I know I have no need, nor she of me. There is no one else I'd do this with," he said, kissing her lips, her head tilted to one side as she leaned her back against his chest. "And no one else I'd ever wish to," he added as he kissed her again. "Jay, we must," she said when his hand strayed from her stomach. "I hate being king," he said to a giggle. "Well, I love being your queen," she said, kissing him as they readied for the night ahead. It was as they were in the feast itself that he felt it, the tingle in his mind, and he knew he couldn't give in to it there and then, instead waiting until the night was done and he was back in his room. That it would stop him from doing what he wished with his wife, at least temporarily, was a huge price to pay. But he needed to see it for himself, and so he spoke to her, and was happy to see she was as disappointed as he. He lay down on the bed and closed his eyes and went looking for the door, soon finding the eagle as she flew over Gulltown. Gulltown 298 AC. Roderick Rivers. 6 bards working together were far more than usual for any operation that the boss wished them to do. But this was a particularly delicate one, that the man himself only had a dozen guards and that 3 of the bards were expert bowmen would prove the difference. Yet Roderick wondered more about the where than anything else. Gulltown was well garrisoned, and though Elaine had told him the guards wouldn't interfere, it was still a risk. One that he was being well paid for, of course, and they'd never been steered wrong by Elaine in all the years they'd worked for him. Capturing wasn't killing, though, which made it a far trickier endeavor. Capturing U targets unhurt, making it even more so. But that's what he and the others were being paid for, and so they watched the ship readying for the arrival of their quarry. When word had come to them to follow the eagle's lead, Roderick had thought it some sort of jape, yet the eagle had appeared on the ledge of their rooms and had taken them straight to the man and woman. At first he'd thought to take them there, but the eagle had screeched when he'd suggested it, and Roderick had felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. It had made them speak more of the dangers of taking them indoors, and he'd then seen some of the problems that arose from it. Tighter surroundings were more easily defendable, while there was only one way in or out that was not always as big an advantage as it could be to those attacking. A bottleneck could be created and a small number of men could hold out for a long time. So they'd abandoned that plan, and now all 6 of them sat and waited, and then he saw the eagle flying in the sky, and he knew it was time. He nodded to the bowmen, watching them take up their positions and ready their arrows, and he and the other 2 swordsmen quickly ran to their own. The carriage arrived, and when he saw the small man and the 2 guards who helped the woman out of it, Roderick gave the signal to fire. "We go as soon as the second volley is launched," he said. "Oh, alive?" Desmore asked. "Alive," he said. "Oh." The first arrows hit home cleanly. The second volley wasn't as successful, and Roderick saw the panicked look on the thin mustachioed man's face. He drew his sword and rushed in, looking on as 2 of the guards simply ran away, and as another one was hit once again with an arrow, this one taking his life. It left them with just 4, and the 2 who were dragging the clearly half-asleep woman to the ship, the man running on ahead like the craven he was. As Roderick made his way towards them, he saw one of them fall with an arrow in his leg, leaving him only one to face. That one let go of the woman and pulled out his sword, the woman collapsing to the ground. "Who the fuck sent you?" The guard shouted at him. "Does it matter you should run?" He said back, "Fuck you. A man's gotta earn a living," the guard said as he aimed his sword at Roderick's head, Roderick dodging out of the way. "Dying's not much of a living," he said, and the guard faltered. They circled each other for a bit, the woman still laying on the ground, the man on the ship torn between running to her and getting the ship to set off. Cat, run to me, my love, run," the man shouted, though the woman looked in no fit state to respond. Roderick watched as the guard looked behind him and then dropped his sword. Once it hit the ground, he motioned to the archers not to fire, and then moved to the woman. Her eyes were heavy and she barely seemed to notice him, Roderick soon noticing that there were marks on her neck, from where her husband had no doubt gotten a little too amorous. "What's wrong with her?" he asked the guard who looked to the ship. "He fucking drugged her most days," the guard said disgustedly. It made Roderick look to the ship and see it had cast off, and then he gave the signal to the archers. Only one of the arrows hit home, and the man on the deck crumbled. Roderick looked on hopefully, only to find that he rose and the arrow was just in his shoulder and not anywhere lethal. He cursed they'd not used poison tips, but then again, this was not supposed to be a killing. Still, he knew Elaine wouldn't be happy that Littlefinger had escaped. "What were you giving her?" he asked. "Not me, Hardin has it in his pack," the guard said, pointing to one of the bodies on the ground. "You should go. Find another line of work, my friend. You'll live longer," he said as he helped the woman to her feet. "Yeah, whatever," the guard said, grumbling as he left. Roderick looked to see the eagle staring at him, and then watched as it flew out to sea. He followed its flight all the way to the ship and looked on as it landed on top of the mast. "Come, Lady Catelyn. There are people who wish to speak to you," Roderick said as one of the other bards reached him and helped him put the woman back in the carriage.